The door to Morning Hearth had barely swung open when it happened. He walked in and the entire room shifted. Not because anyone screamed. Not because anyone ran. Not because a single dramatic thing occurred. It was quieter than that, and somehow more unsettling. It was the way people instinctively straightened in their chairs. The way a man near the window glanced up from his newspaper, caught one look at the figure filling the doorway, and quietly folded the paper and placed it on the table as though preparing for something he couldn't name. The way two women mid-conversation let their words dissolve into silence. The way the ceiling fan kept turning and the soft music kept playing, but the room itself seemed to hold its breath. Ji-tae stepped inside. He was 6 feet and 3 inches of absolute stillness. Not the stillness of a man who was calm. The stillness of a man who had learned long ago that the less he moved, the more space he occupied. He wore a dark gray coat, no tie, collar open at the throat. The tattoos that climbed the side of his neck disappeared beneath the fabric, hinting at everything beneath that the coat was not telling. His jaw was set. His eyes moved slowly across the room, not searching, simply cataloging, the way a man catalogs a room he already owns. He was 35 years old, and he had spent the last 12 years building the kind of name that made other powerful men lower their voices when they used it. He was not supposed to be here. Before we go further, real quick, where in the world are you watching this from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments. These stories travel to the most unexpected corners of the earth, and honestly, it never stops being amazing. If you're new here, hit subscribe, we're just getting started. Now, back to Ji-tae. This was not a place for men like Ji-tae. Morning Hearth was a neighborhood bakery tucked into a quiet corner of Victoria Island, the kind of place where the smell of toasted bread hit you from the street and made you stop walking without deciding to. The kind of place where the chairs did not match, and that felt intentional. Where someone had arranged small ceramic pots of herbs along the windowsill, and the light came through the glass in the morning in long golden columns that made everything look softer than it was. It was warm in the way that very few places are truly warm, not in temperature, but in feeling, as though the walls themselves had absorbed years of easy laughter and unhurried mornings. Ji-tae stood at the edge of all of it and looked around like a man who had accidentally walked into someone else's life. He had not wanted to come. 3 days ago, Min Jun-suk had mentioned this bakery over a late dinner at the hotel in terms that were almost embarrassingly enthusiastic. "The bread," Jun-suk had said, shaking his head slowly in the way he reserved for things he considered genuinely sacred. "Ji-tae, I am telling you, I have eaten bread in 7 countries. What this woman makes is not bread. It is an argument." Ji-tae had dismissed it the way he dismissed most of Jun-suk's culinary discoveries, with a look that communicated he did not have time to be moved by carbohydrates. But something had stayed with him. Not Jun-suk's enthusiasm, exactly. More the word he had used. An argument. Ji-tae had spent his entire adult life surrounded by men who chose their words for effect. Jun-suk almost never did. When Jun-suk said something like that, he meant it. And so on a Tuesday morning, when the first meeting of his day had been pushed by 2 hours and his bodyguard Kong Dae-won had already swept the surrounding 3 blocks for anything that required his attention and found nothing, Ji-tae had done something he almost never did. He had made an unplanned decision. The girl at the counter was young, maybe 19, with a small silver stud in her nose and her braids pinned up under a pale blue kerchief. She took one look at Ji-tae and her smile flickered, not gone, but momentarily interrupted, before she recovered it. "Good morning," she said. "What can I get you?" He pointed at the glass display case. A dark rye loaf. A croissant that looked like someone had taken the concept of a croissant seriously for the first time. A small round pastry dusted with something that might have been cardamom. "Number 47, the girl said, handing him a small card with a number printed on it in hand-stamped ink. "We'll call you when it's ready." He found a table near the back, away from the windows, with a clear sight line to both the entrance and the counter. Dae-won had already positioned himself just outside, visible through the glass, massive and impassive as a door left ajar. Ji-tae sat. He set his phone on the table screen down. He looked around the room. He was the largest person in it by a significant margin. He was also, he realized with something close to discomfort, the most obviously out of place. The other customers had the easy, unhurried quality of people who came here often. A woman was reading something on her tablet and eating a piece of toast with both hands. Two men in their 50s were deep in an argument about something involving a piece of paper they kept sliding back and forth between them. A teenage boy was drawing in a sketchbook, his tongue between his teeth in concentration. Nobody was afraid of anything. Ji-tae could not remember the last time he had been in a room where nobody was afraid of anything. He did not examine the feeling too closely. He ordered a coffee from a passing server, drank it slowly, and waited for his number to be called. The music was low and instrumental, something with a piano and what might have been a bira underneath, unhurried and loose. The bread smell was everywhere, yeast and warmth and something faintly sweet. Despite himself, despite every instinct that told him this place was an indulgence he had no logical reason for, something in his chest settled by approximately 1 degree. He noticed her before he heard his number. She came from the kitchen through a door propped open with a small ceramic dog, carrying a tray of something that smelled immediately of brown butter and orange peel. She was not tall. She moved through the space behind the counter with the specific efficiency of someone who knows exactly where every inch of their kingdom is located. She wore her hair natural, pulled back loosely, and her apron was dusted with flour at the hip in a way she either hadn't noticed or had decided wasn't worth addressing. She set the tray down, said something to the counter girl that made her laugh, and then looked up at the room in a quick, warm survey. Her eyes moved across the tables with the same kind of quiet intelligence Ji-tae himself used to read rooms, except where his reading was tactical, hers seemed simply to be about care. Checking. Is everyone all right? Is anyone waiting too long? Is anything needed? Her gaze landed on Ji-tae for exactly 1 beat. Then moved on. He found himself oddly aware of that beat. 47, the counter girl called. Ji-tae stood, walked to the counter, and picked up the brown paper bag sitting at the far end of the display case. He turned and was halfway back to his table when a voice came from behind him, clear and unhurried. "Excuse me, that one's actually mine." He stopped, turned. The woman from the kitchen was now standing at the counter, looking at him with an expression that was entirely without aggression. She was simply stating a fact. She gestured to the bag in his hand and then to a different bag at the other end of the counter, a larger one, cream-colored paper with a small green stamp on it. "Yours is the one on the right," she said. "I think Maya put them down in the wrong order. I'm so sorry about that." And here it was. The thing that had lived inside Han Ji-tae for 16 years, coiled and patient and ready to detonate the moment any woman directed words at him that required a response. His mouth opened. He knew what he wanted to say. It was simple. It was 3 words. "No problem, thanks." That was it. That was the entire sentence required by this moment. 3 words, not one of them longer than 2 syllables, and then he could pick up the correct bag and leave, and this would be nothing, a 15-second exchange of no consequence to anyone. His mouth opened, and the words, those 3 small, harmless, cooperative words, hit something in his throat like a wall. "I," he said. The woman waited. Patient. Not in the pitying way that people waited when they saw it coming. Just waiting. He stopped. Started again. The familiar tightening across his jaw, the heat that climbed from his collar, the awful awareness of his own tongue becoming a foreign object in his mouth. Didn't. A man 2 tables away had looked up. Then a woman near the window. The teenage boy with the sketchbook had stopped drawing. This was the nightmare. Not the silence. The watching. The way a room full of strangers became an audience for the very thing he had spent 16 years learning to never allow them to see. Han Ji-tae, who had sat across from men who had tried to have him killed and spoken calmly about the weather. Han Ji-tae, whose voice on a phone call could make the recipient's hands sweat before he had finished his first sentence. Han Ji-tae, who had given instructions to rooms of 50 armed men without once raising his voice above conversational. Han Ji-tae could not say 3 words to a baker. He felt the humiliation like a physical weight pressing down between his shoulder blades, that particular flavor of shame that comes not from failure but from exposure, from being seen in the exact shape of the thing you have spent half your life refusing to let anyone see. And then Amara Okoye did something unexpected. She picked up the bag from the counter end, his correct bag, and she walked around the display case and held it out to him directly. She had also picked up the bag he was still holding. The one that was hers, smoothly, A gentle transaction. And as she did, she turned to the room in the most natural gesture imaginable, calling out to no one in particular, "Maya, I keep telling you, the tall bags on the left are the custom orders, the cream ones on the right are the counter orders. We've confused 3 people this week, love." She said it warmly, as though she were relaying a small amusing workplace comedy, and Maya called back from somewhere behind the counter with an apologetic groan, and the 2 older men laughed, and just like that the room's attention had somewhere more interesting to land than on Ji-tae. He stood there holding his correct bag. His heart was doing something he refused to acknowledge. She turned back to him and said nothing about what had just happened. She simply said, "There's a cardamom roll in there that's still warm. It's better with the coffee, if you haven't finished yours." And she walked back through the door propped open with a small ceramic dog. Ji-tae returned to his table. He sat. He drank the last of his coffee, which was still warm. He did not open the bag. He sat for perhaps 3 more minutes, not looking at his phone, not looking at the door, not doing the perpetual threat assessment that his body performed automatically in every room. He just sat with the low music and the bread smell and the weight of what had just happened settling into a shape he wasn't ready to name. When he finally stood to leave, he picked up the bag and walked out without looking back at the counter. Day-one fell into step beside him on the pavement without comment, which was one of the things Ji-tae valued most about him. The man had an exquisite sense of when silence was the correct response. They were in the car before Ji-tae opened the bag. Inside, the dark rye, the croissant, the cardamom pastry, and something extra. A small folded square of paper, cream-colored, tucked against the inside corner of the bag as though it had always been there. He unfolded it with a care he would not have been able to explain. The handwriting was confident and unhurried, in black ink. "Take your time. Good conversations are worth waiting for." He read it once. Then again. Then a 3rd time. The car moved through Victoria Island traffic. Day-one drove. Outside, the city went about its business with complete indifference to the fact that Han Ji-tae was sitting in the back seat of an armored SUV reading a handwritten note from a baker and feeling, for the first time in a very long time, something that he could only describe as the exact opposite of shame. He folded the note carefully and put it in his inside coat pocket. He did not examine why. Now, to understand what that note meant, what those 7 words meant, to a man like Han Ji-tae, you would need to understand the 16 years that preceded the moment he read them. And to understand those 16 years, you would need to begin at the beginning. Not the beginning of his empire, which most people who studied him would point to. The real beginning. The one nobody talked about because nobody knew. He was 19 the first time it happened. He had been aware of the stutter since childhood. A slight catch, occasional, manageable, the kind of thing that responded poorly to stress and exhaustion and that most children grew through. He had largely grown through it. By his mid-teens it was barely present, a ghost of an interruption that appeared only when he was very tired or very afraid, and he had learned to manage both of those states with a discipline that his teachers found remarkable and his father found useful. His father was not a gentleman. He ran a network of companies that were legitimate on paper and something considerably less than that in practice, and he had groomed Ji-tae from adolescence to inherit and expand what he had built. Ji-tae had learned to be still and watchful in rooms where stillness and watchfulness were survival skills. He had learned to speak carefully. He had learned, above all, to project certainty, because his father's entire operation ran on the fuel of perceived certainty, and any crack in that surface was an invitation for the people circling the edges to push their way in. Then at 19, at a meeting his father had brought him to observe, a real meeting, with real people, the first time Ji-tae had been present for the kind of conversation that had previously existed only as abstractions in his understanding of his father's world, a woman had addressed him directly. She was perhaps 30. She was one of the executives at a company his father was in the process of acquiring through methods that were not entirely voluntary. She was composed and professional, and she had clearly done this before. She turned to Ji-tae because she had been told he was being prepared to take over, and she asked him, reasonably, what his plans were for the existing staff. Ji-tae opened his mouth. What came out was not his voice. It was something that had been waiting underneath his voice for years, patient and terrible, biding its time until the moment the stakes were high enough to bring it out of dormancy. Every eye in the room was on him. His father was beside him. The woman waited with professional courtesy. His entire sentence collapsed. Not a single word made it out whole. Every consonant caught. Every vowel deformed. His jaw locked and locked again, and the silence between his attempts stretched until it was not silence anymore, but something enormous and suffocating that had taken the shape of the room. His father's expression did not change. That was almost the worst of it. But Ji-tae felt the change in the air beside him, the microscopic cooling, the way his father became very still. The meeting was redirected. Someone else spoke. Eventually the room moved on. But Ji-tae sat for the remaining 40 minutes unable to produce a single word, and when they left he looked straight ahead in the car the entire way home, and his father never mentioned it directly, not once, not ever, which was in many ways worse than if he had beaten him. He found a speech therapist 3 weeks later. He went alone, told no one, paid in cash. He went for 2 years. He improved. He built techniques, he built strategies, he built an internal architecture that allowed him to manage the stutter in most circumstances. With men, with older women, with people he had authority over, in situations of genuine danger where his focus narrowed to a point and the anxiety that triggered it simply had no room to operate. But he discovered, through years of painful and methodical testing, that there was one consistent, reliable, devastatingly specific trigger that the techniques could not fully contain. Women his own age. In ordinary, unguarded situations. In the moments between the high stakes and the scripted, where he was simply a man and she was simply a woman and nothing was on the line except the basic dignity of being able to speak. It was those moments that destroyed him every time. Not when something mattered enormously. Not in negotiations or confrontations or any of the situations that made up the fabric of his professional life. It was the small moments. A woman asking him a question at a social event. A female colleague addressing him in passing. A chance encounter in an ordinary place where nothing of consequence was happening, and yet somehow the anxiety roared up from beneath everything and made a ruin of his voice. He had stopped going to social events by the time he was 24. He had restructured his professional life so thoroughly that the problem was almost entirely invisible. Min Jun-suk knew. Day one had figured it out without being told. The man was observant in the particular way that people who love someone are observant, and had simply begun, quietly, to rearrange the landscape around Ji-tae so that the exposures were minimal. Female staff communicated through intermediaries. Restaurants were vetted. Phone calls were delegated. The entire apparatus of his organization bent itself gently around his invisible architecture without ever being asked to acknowledge that the architecture existed. And it had worked. For 16 years it had worked. He had built an empire. He had expanded his father's operation into something that operated across borders and moved through the formal economy and the informal one with equal fluency. He had done things he was not proud of and things he had made necessary and things that he understood had exacted costs he had not fully processed, and through all of it he had maintained the surface, controlled, precise, unreadable, and nobody outside his innermost circle had ever seen the thing underneath. He had told himself, in the particular quiet of late nights when the lie was hardest to maintain, that he could live this way forever. Then a note in a paper bag had said, "Take your time. Good conversations are worth waiting for." He went back the next morning. He told Day One he wanted coffee before the 9 o'clock call. Day One, who had been with him long enough to identify exactly what category of event was occurring, said nothing except, "I'll wait outside, sir," which was more tact than most men get from their closest friend. Ji-tae went in at 8:15. The room was busier than the previous day, the morning rush building. He ordered at the counter for Maya, who had clearly been coached in some manner by the universe itself to recognize him and hand him the correct bag without drama. He found a table. He drank his coffee. He waited. He was not entirely sure what he was waiting for. She came out of the kitchen at 8:40. She moved through the room doing what she always apparently did, checking, adjusting, briefly touching the shoulder of a customer she clearly knew, picking up an empty cup someone had left on the windowsill. She noticed him at approximately the same moment he became aware he had been watching her for longer than was natural. She came to his table. Not in a rushing way. Just came over. "You came back," she said. Simply. Not triumphantly. Just as a statement of fact. He looked at her. He had prepared for this. He had actually, in the privacy of his own mind on the drive over, rehearsed this exact exchange. He would nod. He would say, and he had chosen this phrase specifically for its brevity and its lack of pressure points, "Good coffee." 2 words. Hard initial consonants, both of them, but he could manage that with the breathing exercises. He would say, "Good coffee," and she would say something in return, and they would exchange pleasantries of maximum 4 or 5 sentences, and he would leave, and that would be the extent of it. "Gee," he said. His throat closed. Not as completely as yesterday. A fraction less completely. But enough. He stopped. He breathed. He looked at the table for exactly 2 seconds, which was one of the techniques, removing the audience from your visual field. Then he looked back at her and tried again. "Gee, good coffee," he said. It was not smooth. The first word broke in half, and the second came out whole, and the overall effect was something a generous person might describe as halting, and a less generous person might describe as painful. But he had said it. Both words. The complete sentence, such as it was. Amara sat down. Not in a way that announced itself. She simply pulled out the chair across from him with one hand, a small efficient motion, and sat the way someone sits when they have 12 things to do and have decided to give you 5 minutes of their full attention anyway. She folded her hands on the table. "Did you try the cardamom roll?" she asked. He had tried it. In the car, on the way back to the hotel, he had opened the bag and broken off a piece without planning to, and then finished the entire thing in 4 minutes, which was not the dignified experience he would have chosen to describe. He nodded. "Good?" she asked. He nodded again. "You don't have to talk," she said. "Not as a concession. As information. Some of my regulars come in here, and we've had a relationship for 3 years entirely conducted in gestures and smiles. Mr. Obi over there," she tilted her head toward one of the men from yesterday, the one who had been arguing over a piece of paper, who was back today reading a folded document alone. "He came every day for 6 months before he said a word to me. Now I can barely get him to stop." She said this without any particular warmth beyond the ordinary warmth she seemed to carry everywhere, as though it were simply a story about the place and not a carefully constructed gift. Ji-tae looked at her. She held his gaze with the particular quality of someone who is not waiting for anything specific, who is not leaning toward any particular outcome, who is simply present in the moment with no agenda beyond the moment itself. It was one of the most disarming things he had ever experienced, and he had been in rooms with people who disarmed others for a living. "I'll be back in the kitchen," she said, standing. "The almond paste brioche comes out at 9 if you want to wait." She went back through the door with the ceramic dog. He waited for the brioche. It was extraordinary. He went back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. A routine established itself with the quiet logic of things that are inevitable. 8:15. Counter order from Maya, who had apparently been informed by some force of nature to keep things smooth and undramatic. Table in the back. Coffee. The morning room doing its morning business around him. And then, at some point between his arrival and the moment he left, Amara. She never rushed to him. She never made his arrival an event. She would appear, from the kitchen, from a conversation with a customer, from behind the counter checking on something, and she would come to his table the way she came to everything in her domain, with unhurried, genuine attention. Their conversations began as they had begun on the second day, conducted largely in his nods and her words and the occasional fragment from him that he could push through the wall with sufficient effort. She talked about the bakery. About a supplier in Kano who kept sending her the wrong grade of flour and seemed offended when she corrected him. About a customer who had placed an order for a wedding cake and then spent 3 weeks changing the design to something that was, Amara said with complete equanimity, beginning to resemble a very tall argument. She talked the way people talk when they are comfortable with silence, in full awareness that silence is a legitimate part of conversation and not a problem to be solved. Ji-tae listened. He had always been good at listening. It was one of the skills that had served him most reliably in his professional life, the ability to sit very still and take in everything being said and everything not being said and to find, in the space between those two things, the truth of a situation. But he had never before listened to someone who was not, in some way, in relationship to his power. Everyone he dealt with was either subordinate to him, opposed to him, or negotiating a position relative to him. Every conversation he had was, at some level, transactional. Amara talked to him the way she would talk to any person sitting at her table. She was kind without being soft. She was warm without being eager. She saw him in the way that very few people since his childhood had simply seen him, not the reputation, not the physical weight of him, not the thing he represented, just the man sitting in the chair. It undid him more slowly than anything in his life had ever undone him, and far more completely. By the end of the second week, he was producing, on his better mornings, 3 or 4 sentences of partial coherence before the stutter took the wheel. By the end of the third week, he had managed to tell her, haltingly, that the rye bread was the best thing he had eaten since a restaurant in Seoul 7 years ago, and she had laughed, a real laugh, not polite, actually delighted, and said, "I'll tell the bread you said that. It'll be insufferable," and he had felt something in his chest do something that he did not have an established name for. He was not a man who allowed himself to feel things without examining them. It was one of his disciplines. But this feeling, whatever it was doing, whatever territory it was quietly occupying, he found himself unusually reluctant to look at too directly. It was the way you might avoid looking directly at something bright. Not because you are afraid of it, exactly. Because you are not yet ready to see it clearly. Jun-suk noticed, because Jun-suk noticed everything and had the particular talent of noticing things at exactly the moment most inconvenient for Ji-tae. They were in Ji-tae's hotel suite reviewing the logistics for a series of meetings in Singapore that would require Ji-tae to be out of Lagos for 12 days, and Ji-tae had been less than fully present for approximately 40 minutes of a 90-minute conversation when Jun-suk set down his pen, leaned back in his chair, and said, "You've been to that bakery 8 times in 2 weeks. Ji-tae looked at him. "Day 1 mentions these things," Jun-suk said, without apology. "Not as a report. Just, he notices." Ji-tae returned his eyes to the document in front of him. "The brioche is good," he said. Jun-suk was quiet for a moment. Then, "She handled the stutter." Ji-tae did not answer. "I'm not asking," Jun-suk said. I've known you for 20 years, Ji-tae. I've watched you leave rooms rather than speak to a woman. I've watched you build an entire life around not being seen in that specific way." He paused. "Whatever happened in that bakery, whatever she did, I hope you let yourself go back." Ji-tae looked at him for a long moment. "Singapore is 12 days, he said. Jun-suk picked up his pen. 11, if we move the Friday meeting." The Singapore trip was 11 days. On the flight back, Ji-tae sat with his phone in his hand for an hour staring at nothing in particular. He had thought about the bakery 3 times a day for 11 days and had not examined that frequency because he already knew what the examination would reveal. When the car pulled up in front of Morning Hearth at 7:45 in the morning 2 days after he returned, technically before the bakery opened, as he had miscalculated the time change and his own impatience, he sat outside in the car for 9 minutes until the lights inside changed character and the door was unlocked. He went in. She looked up from behind the counter where she was arranging the morning display, and her face did the thing it always did when she saw him. Nothing performed, just the small genuine brightening of a person who is pleased by something. She said, "You're early." And he said, "I can know." 2 words. Both of them out. The second one clean. She smiled. "Coffee's almost ready." He sat at his table. Day 1 took up his post outside. The morning light came through the large windows in its usual columns. The bread smell wrapped around everything. And for the first time in 11 days, the thing in Ji-tae's chest that had been doing something strange and unnamed settled into a shape that was almost like peace. It was in the 4th week that she told him about her background. He had been attempting, with moderate success and 2 false starts, to describe a building he had seen in Seoul that had struck him as one of the most beautiful things he had ever encountered, and he had managed to convey the essential image even through the stutter, and she had listened with her full attention the way she always did, and when he finished she said, "Did you notice you said that whole last sentence without stopping?" He had not noticed. He thought about it. "The teething about the window," he said. "Yes," she said. "You were thinking about the building instead of thinking about talking. That's when it's easiest, isn't it? When the thought is bigger than the fear." He looked at her. She looked back with that calm, clear quality of hers. Then she said, "I studied communication disorders for 2 years before I decided to open this place instead. I didn't finish the degree, but I learned enough to know how it works." The table was quiet for a moment. "I'm not trying to diagnose you," she said. "And I'm absolutely not trying to fix you, so please don't look at me like that." He realized he had, in fact, been looking at her like that, a particular arrangement of his face that he had been told, on the rare occasions someone was brave enough to tell him anything, communicated a warning. He made a conscious effort to arrange his face differently. "What I mean," she said, "is that I recognize what's happening. And I want you to know that from where I sit, the stutter has never once been the most interesting thing about you. It's just the thing that scared you into thinking it was." He sat with that. She leaned forward slightly, not close, just engaged. "There are some things that help. Not cure, because it's not a disease. Just make the space around it bigger, so it has less power. Breathing, mostly. Pacing. And something that sounds stupidly simple, which is stopping fighting every pause." She said this last part with a small directness that was neither harsh nor gentle, just accurate. The pause is not the enemy. You've made the pause the enemy, and now every time there's silence in your own sentence, you go to war with it, and the war is louder than the pause ever was. He thought about the 16 years of going to war with the pause. He thought about what that war had cost him. "I can show you some of the breathing exercises," she said. "Only if you want. No pressure either way, and it changes nothing about the coffee or the brioche." He looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was behind her. The music was low. 2 tables away, Mr. Obi was reading his document, completely unbothered by anything. Ji-tae said, "Why, yes." The word was small and direct, and he said it without any architecture around it, no technique, no strategy, just the bare fact of it. "Yes." She nodded once, businesslike, as though this were settled. "Tomorrow, 15 minutes before the morning rush. I'll be in the back corner." She stood, picked up an empty cup from a neighboring table, and then paused. "For what it's worth," she said, not looking at him, already moving, "I've been looking forward to what you have to say since the day you walked in here." She went back to her work. Ji-tae sat very still for a while. Then he ordered a second coffee, and the almond brioche, and he sat in the morning light of a bakery in Victoria Island and let himself, for perhaps the first time since he was 19 years old, simply be inside the moment he was in, without monitoring the perimeter of himself for things that could go wrong. Outside, Day One stood on the pavement in the sun. The city moved around them both. And something that had been coiled tight for 16 years began, in the most incremental way imaginable, not dramatically, not suddenly, not with any of the force that Han Ji-tae was accustomed to bringing to things that needed changing, simply, quietly, to loosen. The breathing exercises were not what he expected. He had imagined something clinical. Something that felt like a medical intervention, structured and dispassionate. What Amara showed him the next morning in the back corner of Morning Hearth before the rush arrived, in the low light with the chairs still half up on the tables, was nothing like that. She sat across from him with both hands flat on the table and said, "First thing, when you feel the stutter coming, what do you do?" He thought about it honestly. "IP push." She nodded. "You accelerate into it. Like you're trying to outrun it." "Yes." "What if you didn't?" she said. "What if the moment you felt it coming, instead of pushing forward, you just stopped? Fully stopped. Breathed. And started again." He looked at her. "In the middle of a sentence." "In the middle of a sentence. That's," he paused, "not the stutter. An actual pause. Chosen. That's not how it works. In the situations I'm in. You can't stop in the middle of a sentence." "Why not?" He opened his mouth. Closed it. Thought about the question honestly, which required him to interrogate something he had never questioned because it had always presented itself as a law rather than an assumption. Why not? Because silence was weakness. Because the men in the rooms of his life read silence as confusion, as uncertainty, as an opening. Because in the architecture of power he had inhabited for his entire adult life, the pause was an invitation, and the invitation would be accepted by whoever was quickest. He explained this to her in the truncated, reconstructed way he had learned to explain things. Short sentences, hard stops, enough to convey the shape of it. She listened. When he finished, she said, "You're talking about a room full of people waiting to take something from you." "Yes." "I'm talking about a conversation," she said. "Just a conversation. Between people who aren't trying to take anything." She met his eyes. "This room, for instance." The morning light was coming through the windows. The ceramic dog held the kitchen door open. Somewhere in the back, Something was beginning to smell of cardamom and brown sugar. "In this room," she said, "a pause is just a pause. It means nothing except that you are taking the time you need. And the people sitting at these tables," a small gesture, encompassing Mr. Obi's table, the window seats, the whole warm space, "they are not enemies. They are just people having breakfast. And they do not need you to be anything except whatever you are." He sat with that. She said, "Try something for me. Tell me something, anything, and when you feel it starting, stop. All the way stop. Breathe. Like this." She demonstrated a slow, even breath, in through the nose, out through the mouth, nothing dramatic, just deliberate. And then start again. Not from before the stutter. From the beginning of the thought. He looked at her. Something in him resisted, the old reflex, the deeply grooved preference for the wall over the window. But something else, something that had been accumulating quietly over the past weeks in this room with this woman and this light and this extraordinary bread, tipped the balance. He said, "There's a tea tree." He stopped. Fully stopped. The way she had said. Breathed. Slow. "There's a tree," he started again, "outside the window of the hotel where I stay. I don't know what kind it is. It's very old. When I can't sleep, which is often, I watch the branches." He stopped again, breathing. Continued. "I've never told anyone that before." There was a silence. "That was 4 sentences, Amara said, "and you stopped twice and you finished every single one of them." He had. He noticed, distantly, that his hands were slightly unsteady. Not from fear. From something closer to the feeling you get when a door you have been pushing against for a very long time suddenly opens and you fall forward into the room that was always on the other side. "The tree outside the window," she said. "What do the branches look like at night?" He told her. And then she asked another question, and he answered that one too, and the morning built itself around them in layers of light and bread smell and low music, and the rush came in around them and the room filled and Maya worked the counter and Mr. Obi arrived with his document, and Ji-tae sat and talked. Not smoothly, not without the stutter, which did not disappear and would not disappear, but with a quality he had not brought to speech in 16 years. Without shame. That was what was different. Not the stutter. The stutter was there, imprecise and human. What was different was the thing underneath it, the way he had always treated the stutter as proof of something, as evidence of a fundamental inadequacy that the entire architecture of his life was constructed to conceal. And now, in this back corner of this bakery with this woman who looked at him like he was simply a person worth speaking to, the stutter was just a stutter. A thing his voice did sometimes. Present. Manageable. Not a verdict. He left at 10. He had 2 missed calls from Jun-suk and a message from Day 1 that had been waiting for 40 minutes. He stood on the pavement outside Morning Hearth in the sun and breathed the outside air, which smelled of car exhaust and the ocean and the city doing its enormous indifferent business. Day 1 was watching him with the carefully neutral expression he deployed when he was managing his own feelings about something. "The almond brioche," Ji-tae said. "I brought you one." He held out a small wrapped package. Day 1 took it with both hands and inclined his head in the formal way that meant, in his particular private language, "This is not about the brioche, sir, but thank you for the brioche." Ji-tae got in the car. He pulled out his phone and called Jun-suk. Jun-suk answered on the second ring. Singapore called. "They want to move the first discussion from Wednesday to Monday. I need you to." "Monday is fine," Ji-tae said. A pause on Jun-suk's end. "You sound different." Ji-tae looked out the window at the street. "The brioche," he said, "is extraordinary. You were right about this place." Jun-suk was quiet for a moment, and Ji-tae could hear the particular quality of his silence. The silence of a man who has been a friend for 20 years and knows when something has shifted and has the wisdom to let it sit. "I usually am," Jun-suk said, and returned to the Singapore logistics. The weeks that followed were different from anything in Ji-tae's recent memory, which meant they were different from anything in most of his adult life, which meant they carried a quality that he was only slowly learning to recognize as ordinary. Just ordinary. Just the ordinary texture of mornings in a place he liked, with a person he looked forward to seeing, building incrementally toward a version of himself that could, when the circumstances were right and the thought was larger than the fear, speak. He made progress. Genuine progress, Not the kind he had made at 19 in clinical settings with techniques applied to abstract scenarios, but the kind that comes from practice inside actual life, inside the specific texture of wanting to say something to someone and finding, more often than not, a way to say it. He still stuttered. He would always stutter. The speech therapist had told him as much at 19, and the years had confirmed it. But the territory of what he could say was expanding, and more importantly, the internal architecture of what the stutter meant to him was quietly, systematically, irrevocably changing. He began to notice when he went silent not because of the stutter, but because of the habit of silence. They were different things. He had been confusing them for 16 years. The stutter was involuntary. The silence was a choice he had made, repeatedly, in response to shame. And now, in the space Amara had made, not by building it dramatically, not by declaring it, just by inhabiting it consistently, by being a person who made room and expected nothing and accepted whatever arrived, he was beginning to choose differently. He did not tell her this directly. Not yet. He was not, by nature or by training, a man who named things before they were fully formed. But he noticed it, and he thought she noticed it too, in the way she noticed everything, quietly, without making it a moment. The closest he came, in those weeks, was one morning in the 6th week when he arrived slightly later than usual and found her alone at his table with a cup of tea and 2 things in front of her, a worn paperback and a small notebook in which she was writing something. She looked up when he approached and said, "I was about to give up on you," with a small smile that meant the opposite of the words. He sat down across from her. "I have meetings," he said. The sentence came out whole. He noticed it, filed it, said nothing. "You always have meetings," she said. "Yes." He looked at the notebook. "What are you writing?" She turned it slightly so he could see. A recipe, in her confident handwriting. Something involving pears and black pepper and a component she had labeled simply the thing that makes it work. "What's the thing that makes it work?" he asked. She looked at him with that clear quality, and this time there was something behind it, some thought she was choosing, in the way she chose things. "Sometimes I don't know until I'm in it," she said. "I have a general idea. But the actual thing, you find it while you're making it, not before." He sat with that. "I think that's the most useful thing anyone has ever said to me," he said. She looked at him for a moment, and something in her face did something small and certain that he recognized, distantly, as the expression of a person who has been carrying a feeling for some time and has just decided to stop pretending they haven't. She went back to her notebook. He ordered his coffee. The morning went on around them, full and ordinary, and he would think about this later, on the drive back, on the flights between cities, in the sleepless hours with the old tree outside the window, irreplaceable. Entirely, quietly irreplaceable. He had never in his life had a morning that felt like something he would grieve losing. He had several of them now, every week, at a small table in a bakery in Victoria Island. And he understood, with a particular clarity that comes not from thinking but from the accumulated weight of small true things, that whatever happened next, whatever the full shape of this thing turned out to be, he had already been changed by it. Not fixed. Not rescued. Changed, in the specific way that a person changes when they finally allow themselves to be seen by another person, wholly and without performance, and discover that the thing they spent years believing would destroy them if it were known did not, in fact, destroy anything. It simply stood in the light, and looked, in the light, considerably smaller than it had in the dark. There are things a man can know about himself intellectually that he has never actually felt. Ji-tae had known, in the abstract, that he was lonely. He had known it the way you know a fact about geography, accurately, distantly, without it touching you. He could have described the shape of his loneliness with clinical precision if asked. The particular silence of hotel rooms in foreign cities, the way the space beside him at dinner tables always felt like an accusation, the late-night hours with the old tree outside the window when the strategies and the logistics and the management of his empire had been set aside and there was nothing left to manage except the bare fact of himself. He had known all of this. What he had not known, what he had not been able to know, because knowing it required the specific experience of its opposite, was how much of that loneliness was self-imposed. How much of it was the logical consequence of spending 16 years building walls and calling the walls protection. How much of the silence was not the world withholding something from him, but him, with extraordinary discipline and consistency, refusing to reach. He understood this now. He understood it in the way things are understood when they arrive not as insight but as sensation, felt before they are named, present in the body before the mind catches up. He was in love with Amara Okoye. He had not said this to anyone. He had barely allowed himself to think it in those terms, because thinking it in those terms made it real in a way that demanded a response, and the response terrified him in a manner that 12 years of running a criminal empire across multiple jurisdictions had entirely failed to produce. Because loving someone, actually loving them, not in the managed, contained, strategically bounded way he had permitted himself to care about Jun-suk and Day One, meant being seen in all of it. Not just the stutter. All of it. The empire. The decisions. The things he had built and the things he had broken in the building. The man he was when the coat came off and there was nothing left but the truth of him. He sat with this knowledge for 3 weeks without acting on it, which was, in context, remarkable restraint. On a Thursday morning in the 8th week, 8 weeks since a wrong order and a handwritten note had rearranged the furniture of his interior life, Ji-tae arrived at Morning Hearth at 7:50 and found Amara already at the back table with 2 cups of tea instead of 1. She looked up when he came in and said nothing, just pushed one of the cups toward the empty chair across from her. He sat down. He looked at the cup. "Ginger and lemon," she said. "You've been drinking too much coffee. I can see it in your face." He did not ask how a person saw too much coffee in someone's face. He picked up the cup. It was good, sharp and clean and warm in a way that was different from coffee, more grounded somehow. They sat for a while in the easy silence that had become, over 8 weeks, the most comfortable place he had ever occupied. Then he said, "I need to tell you something." She looked at him. Not with surprise. With the quality of attention she gave everything, full and undefended. He breathed. The way she had taught him. Slow and deliberate. Not to manage the stutter, though it helped with that too, but because what he was about to say was the largest thing he had said to anyone in years and it deserved the preparation. "I'm not." He stopped. Breathed. "What I do. Who I am outside of this." He looked at the table for a moment, then made himself look back at her. I'm not a good man in the way that the world uses that word. The things I run. The organization. It's not." He paused. "I want you to know what you're sitting across from." Amara held his gaze without moving. "Tell me," she said. And so he told her. He told her about his father, and the meeting at 19, and the way the empire had been handed to him like an inheritance he hadn't consented to and had then spent years not just maintaining but expanding, because expansion was the only form of safety he had known how to build. He told her about the operations across borders, the companies that were legitimate and the structures behind them that were not, the agreements made with people whose methods he sometimes controlled and sometimes merely tolerated, the corners of his world that he was not proud of and had not yet found a way to fully dismantle without the whole architecture collapsing in ways that would hurt the people inside it. He told her about the police agencies that tracked him and the rival organizations that had tried to end him and the very particular moral calculus he had developed for living inside the life he had not entirely chosen but had undeniably, at every fork, chosen to continue. He told her about the stutter. The full version, not the managed version he had permitted to surface in the incrementally honest weeks of their mornings, but the complete account. 19 years old in a room of men, the sentence that collapsed, the silence in the car on the way home, the 2 years of therapy and the 16 years of architecture built to compensate for what the therapy had not fixed. The female staff filtered through intermediaries. The restaurants vetted. Day One's quiet, loyal rearrangements of the landscape. The events he had left, the rooms he had exited, the conversations he had refused. The entirety of what hiding cost. He talked for a long time. He stopped when the stutter stopped him and breathed and started again, and he did not apologize for the stops, and she did not fill them. She sat with both hands around her cup of tea, and she listened with that complete quality of hers, and the morning light moved across the table between them as the sun shifted, and the bakery came to life around them with its usual sounds and warmth, and he talked. When he finished, the silence was different from the silences that had come before. It had weight. Not the crushing weight of shame. He knew that weight, had carried it for so long that he'd mistaken it for his own bones, but the clean weight of truth that has been set down on a table and is simply resting there, asking nothing, waiting. Amara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I knew most of it." He looked at her. "Not the details," she said. "Not the specifics. But I knew you were carrying something large. The way you sit in rooms. The way day one moves around you. She paused. The way you looked at this place the first time you walked in, like you were surprised a room like this was allowed to exist in the same world as whatever you'd come from. He was quiet. I'm not going to tell you I don't have questions, she said. I have many questions. I have complicated feelings about some of what you just told me, and I think you know which parts those are, and I think you know that I'm not someone who will pretend otherwise. She set her cup down. But I will also tell you this. She looked at him with the clearest eyes he had ever seen on another person. I have watched you, over these weeks, choose something different. Every single morning. You didn't have to come back. You didn't have to sit down. You didn't have to tell me any of this. And yet every morning, you came back. And every morning, you said a little more. And every morning, her voice was steady, not soft, not careful, just true, you became a little more yourself. He could not speak. Not because of the stutter. Because the stutter requires a word to be attempting, and he had, for the moment, no words. The life you've built, she said, is complicated. I won't pretend it isn't. And I think you know that parts of it have to change. Not for me, but because you already know they have to change. You've known for a while. She tilted her head slightly. Am I wrong? He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. The word came out whole and clean and entirely without effort. She looked at him, and the thing that had been in her face for weeks, that small certain quality that held feeling, was no longer held. It was simply present. All right then, she said. She picked up her cup. He picked up his. The morning went on around them. The city went on outside the windows. And something had been said, and something had been heard, and something was different now in a way that would not be undifferent. Quietly, irrevocably, the way all the real changes are. The months that followed were not simple. He had not expected them to be, and she had not promised simplicity, which was one of the reasons he trusted her. What she had offered, and what she gave, was consistency, the same full attention, the same clear eyes, the same refusal to perform either approval or disapproval, the same morning table and ginger tea, and the particular patience of a woman who understood that real change moves at the pace of the person doing the changing and not a beat faster. He began making changes. Some were small, the kind that exist only in the interior and are invisible to anyone outside, the way he stopped treating silence as defeat, the way he stopped monitoring every room for the exit, the way he gradually stopped waking at 3 in the morning with the full architecture of his anxiety deployed and active. Some were larger. He brought in legal counsel that Jun-suk described, with elaborate understatement, as unusually thorough, and began the long methodical process of restructuring the parts of his operation that he had always known were indefensible but had maintained because the alternative had seemed more dangerous than the status quo. It was not a clean or fast process. It would not be clean or fast for years. But it was moving, and the direction of its movement was deliberate, and he owned the direction in a way he had not owned anything since his father handed him an empire and called it a gift. Jun-suk watched all of this from his customary position of close proximity and editorial restraint. After 2 months of watching, he came to Ji-tae's suite one evening with a bottle of soju and 2 glasses and said, I want you to know that whatever happens, I am with you in it. The restructuring, the exposure, all of it. I'm not going anywhere. He poured 2 glasses. Also, she's extraordinary, in case you needed an outside assessment. Ji-tae accepted the glass. I didn't. I know you didn't, Jun-suk said. I'm offering it anyway. He raised his glass. To the bakery. Ji-tae raised his. To the bakery. Day 1, when Ji-tae told him the direction things were moving, said nothing for a full 30 seconds. Then he said, Sir, in 10 years, I have never once seen you order yourself a second coffee. He paused. You order 2 every morning at Morning Hearth. Another pause. I think that tells us everything. Ji-tae looked at him. I bring you a coffee, Day 1 clarified. She brings you a coffee. You drink both. That's not, Ji-tae began. I'm not judging, sir, Day 1 said. I think it's the finest thing I've witnessed in a decade. The proposal, when it came, was not planned in the way Ji-tae planned most things. He was not a man who operated without strategy, but he had learned, slowly and against every instinct, That the things most worth doing were the ones that arrived not from strategy but from the simple accumulation of truth. He had been sitting at the back table on a Wednesday in the 4th month, the room mid-morning and comfortable around them, and Amara had been telling him about a problem with the bakery's lease renewal. The building's owner had decided to raise the rate in a manner she described, with characteristic precision, as both aggressive and creative, and Ji-tae had listened, and then without planning it, without the usual reconnaissance of the thought before deployment, he had said, "Marry me." The room continued on around them. Maya was calling an order number. Mr. Obi was reading his document. The music played its low, unhurried piano. Amara looked at him. "That came out very clearly," she said. It had 2 words. No stutter. The clearest sentence he could remember producing in the presence of a woman he cared about, possibly the clearest sentence he had produced since he was 19. "I noticed," he said. She looked at him for a long time. He sat with the look. He had been practicing sitting with things, with pauses, with silence, with the open space between words, and he sat with this one, which was considerably larger than most, and breathed and waited. "You know what you're asking," she said finally. "Not a question." "Yes. You know it isn't simple. What your life is. What the restructuring will surface. What people will say when they see us." "Yes. You know that I will not pretend any of it away. I will ask you hard questions, and I will expect real answers, and there will be mornings where neither of us is particularly pleased with the other." "I know," he said. He held her eyes. "I have spent my entire adult life building a life that required me to hide. I don't want to hide anymore. Not any part of it." He breathed. "I want to build something that doesn't need walls." Her face did the thing it did. That small certain movement of a feeling that had been decided some time ago and was simply now arriving at its destination. "Then yes," she said. She said it the way she said everything, without performance, without drama, directly and clearly, as though it were the most logical sentence in the world. Which, Ji-tae thought, it probably was. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. She turned her hand over and held his. Outside, Day One was standing on the pavement in the morning sun. His phone buzzed, a message from Jun-suk that said simply, "Well?" Day One looked through the bakery window at the 2 figures at the back table, the large man and the woman, both very still, something passing between them that he could identify from 30 feet away without being able to name. He typed back, "Yes." Jun-suk's response arrived in 4 seconds. "Soju. Tonight. Don't argue with me." The wedding was small by every measure except the ones that mattered. Ji-tae had spent 12 years being a man whose name moved through rooms before he did. He had sat at tables where the flower arrangements alone cost more than most people's monthly income. He had attended functions where the guest list was itself a form of currency, where being seen was the point and the event was merely the setting for the being seen. He had moved through all of that world with the particular efficiency of someone who understood its mechanics completely and felt almost nothing while operating them. He did not want any of that. He wanted Morning Hearth. Amara had laughed when he suggested it, not dismissively, but the real laugh, the one he had been collecting since the first time he heard it, storing each instance with a care that he would not have been able to explain to anyone who had not spent 16 years in a landscape of managed distance. She had laughed and then looked at him and said, "You actually mean it?" And he had said yes, and she had thought about it for approximately 4 seconds and said, "Saturday then." Before the morning rush. The preparations were minimal and correct. Jun-suk handled the paperwork with a thoroughness that suggested he had been anticipating this assignment for some time. Day One managed the logistics of the small guest list, close family on both sides, a few trusted people who knew the full shape of things and loved them anyway, with the same focused competence he brought to everything. Amara's sister flew in from London and spent the Thursday before the ceremony standing in Morning Hearth's kitchen telling Ji-tae things about Amara's childhood in a tone that managed to be simultaneously warm and quietly threatening. Ji-tae listened to every word of it with complete attention, which seemed to satisfy her. The night before, he sat alone in his hotel room, the same room he had been in for months, the old tree outside the window as familiar now as anything in his life, and he did not sleep. Not from anxiety. Or not only from anxiety. He sat with the full, strange, unprecedented weight of a life that was changing shape, and he let it be strange, and he let it be heavy, and he breathed with the deliberateness Amara had taught him and found that the breathing helped not because it solved anything but because it reminded him that he was here, present, in the moment, not in the 16 years behind him, not in the uncertain territory ahead, but in this room, this night, this particular threshold. He took the note out of his coat pocket. He had been carrying it since the day she put it in the bag, transferred from coat to coat, placed each time in the inside pocket close to his chest, as though it were a document of significant value, which it was. The paper was soft now at the folds. The ink was still clear. Take your time. Good conversations are worth waiting for. He folded it carefully and put it back. Saturday morning arrived with the particular quality of Lagos mornings in that season. Warm early, the sky a pale clear blue above the city's noise, the air carrying salt from the water and the indefinable smell of a city that never completely sleeps. The streets around Victoria Island were not quiet, but they were lighter than midday, the traffic not yet built to its full amplitude, the morning still belonging mostly to people with places to be and reasons they loved for being there. Morning Hearth had been transformed in the understated way that Amara did everything, not disguised or overdressed, but offered its best self. Flowers on the tables, simple, local, vivid. The chairs arranged to face a small cleared space by the large windows where the morning light came in best. Maya had baked, had apparently been baking since 5 in the morning, which Ji-tae learned from day one who had arrived first, characteristically, and the smell of the place was even richer than usual, layered with something that included cardamom and orange blossom and the specific sweetness of a kitchen working with intention. The guests arrived in the half-hour before. Jun-suk, in a suit that managed to be elegant without being emphatic. Day one, in his best clothes, standing to one side with the careful stillness of a man who is moved and managing it. Amara's sister, whose name was Chisholm, who had decided overnight that she approved of Ji-tae and communicated this by bringing him a cup of tea the moment he walked in and squeezing his arm once, firmly, which he understood. His own family, an uncle and 2 cousins from Seoul who had traveled without complaint and without many questions, which was the family quality he most valued. Several others, people who knew things, whole things, and were present anyway, which was the only guest list that mattered. The officiant was a friend of Amara's from the years before the bakery, a woman with a calm face and a way of speaking that made serious things feel accessible rather than heavy. She stood in the light by the windows and waited. Ji-tae stood on one side and watched the kitchen door. Amara came through it. She wore cream, not white, cream, the color of the bakery's paper bags, which Ji-tae thought was either a coincidence or a decision so precisely Amara that it could only have been one or the other. Her hair was down, which he had not seen before. She was wearing earrings that caught the morning light. She walked toward him through her own room, through the room she had built and filled with warmth and inhabited with such consistent grace, and she looked at him the way she had looked at him from the beginning, clearly, fully, without performance, as though what she saw was simply good and worth seeing. He breathed. She reached him and took his hands. Her hands were warm. They were flour-dusted at the knuckles. She had clearly been in the kitchen until the last possible minute, which was so exactly herself that he felt something move through him that had no name but was warm all the way to the edges. The officiant began. The room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when everyone in them has agreed, without saying so, to be fully present. When it came to his vows, Ji-tae had written them himself. Jun-suk had offered to help and Ji-tae had declined, because the help would have made them better in the technical sense and wrong in the way that actually mattered. He had written them in the hotel room over 3 evenings. In the notebook he kept for things that were too important to exist only in his head. He had not practiced them in front of a mirror. He had not rehearsed the delivery. He had read them over once the night before and folded the notebook closed and trusted that the words would be there when he needed them. He looked at Amara's face. He began. I spent. He stopped. Not the stutter. The stutter was there too, would always be there, but this was something different. This was the weight of the words themselves, arriving with their full meaning, refusing to be rushed. He breathed. He looked at her eyes. I spent 16 years building a life that required me to never be seen. I was good at it. I built walls so well that eventually I stopped seeing the walls and just saw the life. And then, he paused again, this time the stutter catching the next word, and he breathed, and the room waited, and he continued, You put a note in a paper bag. And the note said, Take your time. And I have been taking my time ever since. Someone in the room made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cry. "I don't have smooth vowels," he said. "My voice has never been smooth, and it isn't going to start today. What I have is," he breathed, "the truth, which is that you saw me before I was ready to be seen. And you waited. And you made room. And in the room you made, I found out who I was when I stopped hiding." He held her hands a little tighter. "I would like to spend the rest of my life in a room like that. I would like to build that room with you." The light came through the windows in its long morning columns. "I love you," he said. "Clean. Whole. No stutter." "I'll love you," he said again, the stutter arriving on the second attempt the way it sometimes did, and he did not apologize for it and did not correct it, simply let it stand, because it was his voice and his truth, and the stutter was part of both, and he was done treating it as though it were neither. Amara's eyes were bright. Not crying, or almost not. Her jaw was set in the way he had come to recognize as her version of composure under pressure. "I knew," she said, when it was her turn, "within the first week. You probably didn't know. You were very controlled." She smiled. "But the way you listened, the way you actually listened like everything I said mattered, I haven't had that very often. Most people listen to respond. You listened to understand. Even when you couldn't respond, you understood." She paused. "I built this place because I believed that if you make a space warm enough, honest enough, safe enough, people will become who they really are inside it. And you walked into my bakery and became, right in front of me, one of the most remarkable people I have ever known." Her voice was steady and clear. "I'm not afraid of your complications. I'm not afraid of your silences or your stutter or the difficult road ahead of us. I have ginger tea and very good bread, and I have never in my life been afraid of a long conversation." A quiet laugh moved through the room. "I love you," she said, "and I'm going to love watching you become more of yourself for the rest of our lives." The officiant said the necessary words, and they said the necessary words back, and then they were married, and the room erupted in the small private joy of people who have been genuinely rooting for something and have watched it arrive. Jun-suk was the first to embrace Ji-tae, brief and firm and wordless, which said everything. Dae-won shook his hand with both of his own and then appeared to need something from the other side of the room quite urgently, which was the most honest thing Ji-tae had ever seen him do. Chisholm held her sister for a long moment and then held Ji-tae's face in both her hands and said something in Igbo that she did not translate, but her eyes were wet and she was smiling, and he understood the meaning if not the words. Maya came out of the kitchen with something on a tray, the almond brioche, a full batch, still warm, and set it on the counter and declared, with the authority of a 19-year-old who has decided this is her contribution to history, "Everyone eat." Everyone ate. The morning filled with voices and the clink of cups and the smell of good bread and the particular sound of a small room full of people who are genuinely happy, which is one of the rarest sounds in the world and unmistakable when you hear it. Ji-tae stood near the window with Amara beside him, her hand in his, the morning light on both of them, the city outside going about its enormous business, and he stood inside the moment the way he had been learning to stand inside moments, fully present, without monitoring the exits, without managing the perimeter, just there, and he felt, for the first time in his life, as though his life had caught up with him. As though the distance he had always felt between himself and the moments he was living in had, without announcement, closed. He looked at her. She was watching Maya try to simultaneously serve brioche and take photographs on her phone, which was going as well as that sounds. She turned and found his eyes and smiled. The full one, the real one, the one he had been collecting since the beginning. He squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. They stayed like that in the light, among the people they loved, in a room that smelled of everything good. And that, for now, was enough. But here is what nobody in that room knew. 3,000 miles away, in a glass tower in Seoul, a meeting was taking place. Not a dramatic meeting, no raised voices, no visible tension. Just 4 men around a table with water glasses and the kind of stillness that precedes things. One of them had a folder. Inside the folder were photographs. Morning Hearth. Victoria Island. A large man with tattoos at a bakery table. A woman with flour on her hands. The man with the folder was someone who had been watching Ji-tae's restructuring of the organization with the close and patient attention of a man who had something to lose. He closed the folder. He said, very quietly, to the room, "Find out who she is." In a bakery on Victoria Island, Han Ji-tae and his wife were eating almond brioche in the morning light, surrounded by the people who loved them, and they did not know this. They were happy. And happiness, as anyone who has lived long enough can tell you, is the thing that people with nothing left to threaten you with will reach for first. The story was not over. It was, in every way that mattered, just beginning. And that right there is why this story will stay with you. If you felt something, even just a flutter, even just a tightening in the chest during those vows, then you already know this story found you for a reason. Hit that subscribe button, because there is so much more where this came from, and I would hate for you to miss what comes next. Drop a comment and tell me your favorite moment from this story. I read every single one and they genuinely make my day. And one more thing. Tell me where in the world you're watching from right now. Seriously, drop your city, your country, anything. These stories reach places I never imagined, and knowing where you are means everything to me. Until next time, stay safe, stay loved, and never stop letting yourself be seen.